The sun bled into the horizon, staining the sky with hues of crimson and gold as the village of Naruma braced for the night. The heat of the savannah lingered in the air, heavy and thick, but the unease among the people was stronger. Doors were bolted, flames flickered in clay lanterns, and hushed prayers wove through the wind like whispers from ancient ghosts. Tonight, the child was to be born, the moment that should have been to been. But here, in Dorama, birth was a race against the rising sun. Inside modest hut, the air smelled of burning herbs, sweat, and the metallic scent of fear. Nabesu, her skin glistening with labor struggle, gritted her teeth as another wave of pain tore through her body. The contractions were erratic, stubborn, as if the child itself hesitated to leave the safety of the womb. The old midwife, Mokaya, moved with practiced urgency, her hands steady prompt the storm brewing in her eyes. She had seen this before. She knew what was at stake. Outside, the village chief, Equim, stood near the entrance, his posture rigid. He watched the people of Naruma moving like restless spirits, avoiding his gaze. Then were afraid to acknowledge what was happening inside the hut. The birth under the wrong circumstances could invite disaster. No one knew the exact consequences, only that the elders had warned of it for generations. Is it close? His voice was low, measured, but therein mistaking the tension in it. Mokaya barely glanced at him, too focused on Nabesu. It must happen before the first rays of dawn. The silence stretched between them, suffocating. Outside, the cicadas drone on, their endless song weaving the rustling of the acacia trees. The night pressed in, but time was slipping away. Zuberi, Nabasi's older brother, paced outside, his hands clenched into fists. The weight of his screams cut through his chest like a dull knife. He had always dismissed the village's rules as nothing more than stories meant to control the weak-minded. But now, with a fear gripping his gut, doubt gnawed at him. "This is madness," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. How can a child's birth be cursed simply because of the time of day? And the one answered. Inside, Nabasi's breathing became ragged. Mokaya wiped her forehead, her voice to calm whisper against the storm. "You must push, child. We are running out of time." Tears pulled in Nabasi's eyes. I can't." "You must." She let out a strangled cry, muscles trembling as she fought against her own body's hesitance. Sweat beaded along her skin, trickling down in slow, desperate rivers. The baby was resisting. Why? The wind outside shifted suddenly, carrying with it a strange, unnatural stillness. The torches lining the village flickered, their flames bending as if responding to an unseen presence. The villagers noticed. Eyes darted toward the hut, toward the sky, toward the unseen force pressing down on their bones. The chief exhaled sharply. "If the child is not born before sunrise." The words hum, unfinished, and one dared to speak them aloud. Zuberi stepped closer, his jaw tight. "What they? Were you not telling us?" Mokaya's hand hovered over her chest, fingers clutching the small leather power that never left her neck. Her gaze, once firm and umhaken, now held a shadow of something he had never seen in her before. Debt. The elders spoke of this long ago, she murmured, eyes flicking to the door, as if the very walls of the hut might betray her words. A child born beneath the sun will not belong to the world of man. Nabesa let out another choked cry, her body arching in pain. Outside, the wind held again, but this time it carried something else, something deeper, older. A whisper that did not belong to the living. Zuberi's heart pounded against his ribs. His body screamed at him to run, to pull history from this place and defy every whispered legend. But when he looked at Mokaya, at the chief, at the villagers frozen in fear just beyond the door, he realized something chilling. No one had ever dared to let a child be born in the light of day. Not once, because no one had ever survived to tell what happened next. Zuberi stood with his back pressed against the rough clay wall of his sister's hut, his breathing shallow, his mind a storm. His palms were damp with sweat, thought the night breeze carried the cool scent of damp earth and distant acacia blossoms. The whispers of the villagers, scattered like dry leaves on the wind, clawed at his thoughts. Each hushed voice spoke of things he had tried to bury: curses, shadows, and the price of daylight. He had mocked these tales once, dismissed them as stories to keep children from wandering too far. But tonight, with his sister's life hanging on the edge, those stories felt like chains around his chest. His heart pounded harder as another scream broke from the bossy inside the hut. It was raw, desperate, sound he knew too well. He had heard that same sound the night Histo bled out on this very soil, her breath fading as Mokaya fought to pull Hist's sister into the world. He had been 13 then, old enough to understand death, but too young to carry its weight. That night had carved a hole in him. His mother's body was cold before dawn, and when they placed the newborn in his arms, he had the anger rise with his grief. He had blamed the child, blamed the gods, blamed Mokaya's shaking hands. But he had never blamed the son. Until now, he rubbed his temples, tried to push the memories aside. Histo's mother had died at night under the right stars, yet they said she had still paid the price. Whispers had spread that her labor had brushed too close to dawn. The sun had tasted her struggle and demanded her soul. Zuberi had laughed then, bitterly, calling the villagers cowards hiding behind old superstitions. But now, watching Mokaya's furrowed brow and the tight grip she kept on that worn leather pouch around her neck, nor right he wavered. This is just superstition. If the child is born after sunrise, nothing will happen, he whispered, thought his voice cracked at the edges. He was wanting to believe it. He needed to believe it, but his hands trembled, betraying him. The chief's voice cut through the night like a blade, low and firm, asking if the birth was near. Mokaya's reply was quiet, but carried the weight of generations. It must before the first rays of dawn. Those words clung to Zuberi's skin like smoke. He shifted his gaze to the horizon beyond the village, where the darkness still held dominion, but he knew the sun waited, patient, inevitable. His chest tightened as he thought of his sister. Nebesu was strong, but he had seen fear in her eyes when she first felt the pain. She had squeezed his hand, her grip trembling, and whispered the words her mother had spoken before her last breath. "Kept me safe," he had promised. But now, as he listened to her laboring breaths through the thin walls, he felt that promise slipping through his fingers. Mokaya's chant inside the hut grew louder, the ancient words curling into the night air. Incense burned, filling the hut with a pungent blend of ash and herbs, an offering to keep the spirits at bay. Zuberi inhaled sharply. He remembered the scent from his Stura Histo's final night. It turned his stomach now, as it had then. Sudden gust of wind swept through the village, rattling the wooden fences and making the torches flicker. Zuberi froze. For a brief moment, the air felt wrong, thicker, heavier. His skin prickled. The wind carried something else with it, something he could not name. He glanced at the other villagers huddled by their doors, their faces pale in the dim light. They felt it too. The child born beneath the sun will not belong to the world of man. That was what Mokaya had said earlier, her voice barely above to whisper. He had laughed then, but now the worms latched on the ribs like thorns. He tried to shake it off. He reminded himself that he was Hunter, a man who had faced lions and leopards with nothing but a spear. He had traced beasts through the wild, seen death in their eyes, and stood his ground. But this was different. He could not fight what he did not understand. Another scream from the Besu pulled him back. He stepped toward the door, his instincts urging him to something yeast. He was wanted to storm inside, to lift her in his arms, and carry her away from his cursed place. Take her far from the whispers, the shadows, and the waiting sun. But where warm Hooker, and in free the curse follow. The chief's voice was near again, low but sharp. He spoke of preparations. If the child came after dawn, there would be consequences. Zuberi's pulse quickened. What consequences? He presided, but the chief turned away. Zuberi's jaw tightened. He was wanted to grab the man, shake the truth out of him. But he saw the fear in the chief's eyes, the same fear mirrored in every face in the village. That fear was older than all of them. The sky above remained dark, but the stars had begun to shift, giving their subtle warning that night was aging. The horizon would soon glow with that first faint light. Time was thinning. Zuberi's hand went to the small scar on Histo's forearm, the mark he had given himself the day their mother was buried. He had carved it with a blade, the silent vow to protect his sister. He traced it now, his breath shallow. He was in the longest right he could keep that vow. Voice dry-fied from inside the hut. Nabasi's voice, weak but floating. She was calling for him. His heart twisted. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching long beneath the flickering torch. He paused, one foot on the threshold. "Stay back." Mokaya's voice cut sharply from within. Zuberi's fist tightened. He hated feeling powerless. He hated the rituals, the secrets, but most of all, he hated that he was starting to believe in them. The faint sounds stirred in the distance, beyond the village, like the groaning of trees bending under the weight they could not bear. It was subtle, almost too faint to notice. But Zuberi heard it. It felt wrong. He pre-siled his back against the hut again, heart racing. His thoughts tangled between reason and fear. Hai told himself that morning will come. The sun would rise, and nothing will change. The baby will cry, Nabesu will smile, and life will go on. But deep down, he wasn't sure, and the first hints of purple began to brush against the sky's edges. That uncertainty settled into his bones. The cries of Nabesu cut through the night like a blade, scraping over stone, raw and desperate, each one dragging longer than the last. Her voice cracked, giving way to guttural gasps, the kind that signaled her strength was slipping. Inside the cramped hut, the thick air clung to skin like damp cloth. Sweat pooled on the clay floor beneath her trembling body, mixing with the faint traces of blood. The scent of burnt herbs hung heavily, but it could not mask the metallic tang of suffering. The flickering light of the fire cast shadows that danced on the walls, twisted shapes that seemed to mock the life struggling to emerge. Mokaya pressed her hand firmly against Nabasi's swollen belly, her face etched with concern that she tried disputedly to conceal. The contractions were slowing, and that was not a good sign. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a wooden bowl of water, dipping a cloth to cool Nabasi's burning forehead. Her own heart pounded faster with each passing moment. She had delivered many children, but none under this kind of pressure, none this close to dawn. Her gaze flicked toward the small opening in the roof, where the darkness above seemed thinner than before. The sky was changing. She felt it in her bones. Outside, Zuberi shifted his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting toward the horizon every few breaths. The stars that had UID him countless nights during the hunt were beginning to fade, swallowed by a faint hue of purple bleeding into the edges of the sky. His chest tightened. He knew what that meant. Dawn was approaching. Hand clawed his ribs, but he forced it down. He needed to stay sharp. But the echoes of his sister's agony from inside the hut made that nearly impossible. The villagers gathered in clusters near their homes, faces half lit by trembling torches. They whispered among themselves, voices brit with fear. Some clutched small charms made of bone and string. O'Hairs merely held each other's hands. If unity hold back whatever curse loomed beyond the horizon. They all knew the rule. No one could be born in the light of day. Yet here they stood, watching time slip away like water through cracked fingers. Equim, the chief, stepped closer to Zuberi, his voice low and firm, thought it carried the weight of unease. If the child is not born before sunrise, we must act. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but the tension in his betrayed what his words did not. There was no double in his mind. Action will be taken. Zuberi's pulse quickened. Akal, his tone was Sean he intended, but the dread simmering beneath his skin made it different to mask. He needed answers. He needed to know what they WAT from to his sister, what they would from to her child. Equim's gaze shifted toward Mokaya's HUT, then down to the ground, avoiding the question. His silence was more telling than any words could have been. Zuberi felt his stomach twist. He stepped forward, hoary voice rising, demanding to know. But the chief's lips remained pre-sealed together. The only response was the tightening of Mokaya's fingers around the leather power hanging from her neck. The pouch she had never removed, not since Subari was a child. He had always thought it was simply a relic of the elders, the symbol of her role as the village midwife. But now he sensed it was more. Her knuckles whitened around it, and her eyes held something that made his skin crawl. Fear, yes, but also readiness. She was prepared for what might come. Another scream tore from inside the hut, louder this time, followed by desperate panting. Nabasi's voice wavered, begging for help, for relief. Subari's fists clutched at his sides. His heart urged him to rush in, to shield her from whatever ancient curse had poisoned this night. But his mind held him back. Didn't he know what lay in beyond that door? What he might find if the first light touched his sister's child. Gust of wind swept through the village, carrying with it a strange, faint sound, low, guttural moan, like something ancient stirring beneath the earth. It was distant, almost imperceptible. Butine, who heard it, stiffened. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Old men murmured protective chants under breath. Even the dogs that usually roamed freely were nowhere to be seen. Subari's breathing grew shallow. He turned back to Equim, his voice more urgent. What happens if the sun rises before the child's born? But the chief's eyes remained on the horizon. He did not answer. He did not need to. The sky continued its slow betrayal, the faintest streak of pink licking at the edges of the dark. Time was finning. Subari's thoughts raced. Could they move Nabesu? Could they delay the dawn, somehow? His hunter's instincts screamed for action, but every idea crumbled beneath the weight of the unknown. He had faced predators before, lions, hyenas, even the occasional rogue elephant. He knew their patterns, their weaknesses, but this was predator he could not see. One works GWS stretched beyond the physical world. Another cry from Nabesu snapped him back. Her voice was hoarse now, cracking under the strain. Mokaya's chants grew louder, faster, but there was a tremor in them. She was afraid. Subari could hear it. He could feel it. The villagers were silent now, their eyes fixed on the hut as thought expecting it to collapse into itself. Subari's gaze fell on his sister's home, the place their mother had once laughed, where he had played as boy, where he had sworn to protect Histo family. That hut now felt like a tomb, trapping his sister inside with forces he could not name. The child born beneath the sun will not belong to the world of man. The words echoed in his skull. He was wanted to reject them, to tear them apart with reason. But reason had no place here. Not tonight, not in Dorma. The pouch around Mokaya's neck shifted slightly as she leaned over Nabesu. Subari's eyes narrowed. He remembered his mother's dying breaths, the way Mokaya had whispered over her body, clutching that same pouch. He has been too young to understand then. But now, terrible thought crept into his mind. Had she done something that night? Had she acted to protect the village at the cost of his mother's life? Subari's chest tightened. He stepped toward the door, his voice LOW, but laced with desperation. What will you do if she fails? Mokaya's chanting paused, just for heartbeat. It was brief, but Subari saw it, the flicker of guilt in her eyes. Another gust of wind, cold this time. The horizon brightened ever so slightly. Dawn was coming, and with it something else. The first sliver of sunlight cut through the sky like a blade, slicing away the veil of night that had cloaked Doroma. The horizon bled with the pale glow of dawn, brushing the village in hues of orange and purple. But inside the cramped hut, teams seemed to stretch unnaturally. Nabasi let out the final, shattered scream, her voice breakage into ragged gasps as her body gave one last push. The child slipped into Mokaya's hands, small, warm, fragile. For breath, there was nothing but the sound of his shallow breathing and the faint whimper of new life. Relief should have filled the air but didn't. Instead, an unbearable stillness crept over everything, heavier than the humid heat that clubbed to the walls. Mokaya's fingers froze the moment her gaze met the child's eyes. They were not the dark, gentle eyes of an infant born under the stars. They gleamed with an unnatural brilliance, deep gold, almost liquid, reflecting the morning light like molten metal. The irises poosed faintly, as thought alive with the own rhythm. Her breath caucho in her throat. Her heart raced. This was not right. This was not human. Nabesu, exhausted and trembling, weakly lifted her head to see her baby. Her lips parted to ask if it was a boy or girl, but before the words escaped, she noticed Mokaya's expression. Fear, pure and absolute. Nabasi's joy turned to dread in an instant. Outside, the first rays of the sun kissed the rooftops, and the villagers, who had been holding their breath through the night, exhaled. But the relief lasted mere seconds. A shriek pierced the silence. Cry not from the hut, but from the sky itself. The sun, which had just begun to rise, seemed to flick like a flame cock in the wind. Darkness, like a living thing, crawled back over the village, swallowing the dawn. Voices erupted in panic. Motors pulled their children into their homes. Men gripped their spears, thought none knew what were preparing to fight. The sky above twisted, unnatural, as if the balance between day and night had fractured. Whispers of the old stories surfaced in the crowd, tales of the first days, when the sun and the shadows had fought for dominion over the earth, and the birth of a cursed child had nearly unraveled creation itself. Zuberi's blood ran cold. He had heard those stories by the fireside as a boy, but now, the terror in the eyes of grown man made him realize they were not just tales. They were warnings. Equim grabbed Zuberi's arm with a grip so tight it burned. His voice shook with anger and fear. You fool, you don't understand what you have done. Spattle flew from his lips, but his eyes were not on Zuberi. They were fixed on the hut, on the darkening sky, on the horizon beyond the mountains. Zuberi wrenched his arm free, confusion and fury rising within him. He stumbled toward the hut, pushing past trembling villagers. His sister was in there. His blood. He had promised to protect her. He needed to see her to see the child. But as he stepped closer, the earth beneath his feet trembled, low, guttural vibration, like the growl of beasts too large to be seen. Mokaya emerged from the hut, clutching the baby to her chest, her face pale and damp with sweat. She looked older than ever before, if the years had pressed down on her all at once. Her lips trembled as she whispered that it was too late. The child had come with the sun. Zuberi's eyes dropped to the infant swaddled in cloth. Its small face was peaceful. Butch eyes, Tinos eyes burned like the sun itself. His heart twisted. This was his kin. But every instinct in his body screamed that this child was not meant for their world. Guttural wail echoed from the distant mountains, low, ancient, and filled with hunger. The air grew to cold the sun's presence. Shadow stirred beyond the hills. It formed shifting like smoke, taller than any tree, with limbs that stretched unnaturally, moving in ways that defied nature. It advanced toward the village, slow but deliberate, each step causing the ground to vibrate. The elders had spoken of this, the sundering, when a child born out of time would open the veil between the realms of the living and the dead. Child who belonged to neither day nor night, but to something older, something that lurked beyond the reach of man. Zuberi's chest tightened. He turned to Equim, demanding to know what they had awakened. The chief's voice cracked as he answered. This is the price for breaking order. The balance between life and death is not ours to command. The sun was our shield, the night our boundary. You let them meet, and now something is crossed. The ground trembled beneath bare feet as the shadow took its place in the heart of Nduruma. It stood taller than any tree in the village, its body neither fully solid nor entirely mist. Limbs stretched unnaturally, shifting like smoke caoutchouc in a slow wind. Where its face should have been, there was only a void. Darkness so absolute it had seemed to swallow light itself. From that emptiness came a sound, thousands of voices whispering in unison, overlapping, hissing words that did not belong to human tongues. The air grew colder. The warmth of the sun stripped away, leaving only the damp breath of fear hanging over the village. The whispers coalesced into a single phrase, each word scraping against the ears like stone on bone. The child belongs to the night. The villagers who have not already fled drop to their knees, their heads lowered, eyes shut tightly, as thought refusing to look might spare their souls. The words carried weight, ancient and binding. They were not a threat, they were the sentence. Zuberi's heart ported against his ribs as his hand tightened around the shaft of a spear. His body screamed for action, but his mind faltered. He knew this weapon was useless against something born from the space between life and death. Yet he raised it all the same, because doing nothing felt like surrender. His gaze darted toward the hut. Nabasi's shallow breaths could still be heard from within, each exhale weaker, faker than the last. The child, wrapped in Mokaya's trembling arms, remained silent, its golden eyes wide and unblinking. Zuberi stepped forward, muscles tense, but before he could act, Mokaya's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Her voice was low, but there was steel beneath her panic. "You cannot fight it. There's only one way." Her other hand fumbled with the work leather pouch hanging from her neck, the same relic she had clutched the night their mother died. Her fingers slipped inside, pulling free a small object, an amulet carved from bone, etched with symbols older than the village itself. It polenta faintly, as thought holding the last embers of a fire long forgotten. Zuberi's eyes locked onto it, memories flashing, his mother's final cries, the way Mokaya had whispered over her body, clutching that same relic. He had always thought it was blessing. Now, he feared it had been something far darker. His breath quickened, but before he could speak, Mokaya began to chant. Her voice carried the weight of generations, each syllable spoken with precision, as thought a single error could unravel what little hope had left. The sky shifted in response. The slivers of sunlight that had pierced the darkness dimmed, swallowed by thick, black clouds that stretched unnaturally fast across the horizon. They became night once more. The villagers gasped in unison. The sun had not set, yet its presence washed. The warmth was gone. The air turned heavy with dampness, the scent of wet earth mixing with the bitter sting of burned herbs. The creature hesitated, its shifting form paused, the tendrils of shadow recoiling slightly, as though confused. The void where its face should have been tilted, considering this change in the world. Its whispers softened, in a longing for command, but the murmurs, uncertain. The infant let out a sharp cry, first real sound since birth. It was not the fragile wail of a newborn, but something stronger, sharper, like a voice not entirely human. The villagers flinched at the sound, but Zuberi felt something stir within him, something beyond fear. This was his blood, his sister's child. Whatever power ran through its veins, it was still family. Mokaya's chant slowed, her breathing labored, sweat beading on her brow. She turned to Zuberi, her voice cracking under the weight of desperation. "You must take the child beyond the river, to the sacred lands. Only there will the curse be lifted." Her eyes held his with finality. There was no other path. She had bought the moments, nothing more. This darkness will not hold forever. The guardian would not be deceived for long. Zuberi's chest tightened. He looked back at the hut. Nabasi's hand dangled from the edge of her sleeping mat, fingers twitching weakly. Her face was pale, but she was alive. He knew what taking the child meant. He will leave his sister in her weakest moment, and there was no promise he will return. But if he stayed, the child would die, or worse so, live and bring death to all. His mind raced to his mother's face the night she passed. He'd been helpless then. He will not be helpless now. His grip on the spear loosened. He stepped toward Mokaya, his voice low, steady, masking the storm within him. "How far is the sacred land?" Mokaya's eyes flickered with relief. Thought it was laced with grief. 2 days beyond the river, to the forest of Ashula. The path is dangerous, but it is the only way. Zuberi's mouth dried. He knew those lands. Hunters spoke of them in hushed tones, of beasts that moved unseen, of trees that whispered at night, of those who wandering too far and never retread. But none of those stories carried the weight of what startled before him now. He hadn't the chill-eyed. He will face whatever lay beyond that river, or he will watch his village drown in darkness. The whispers from the creature grew louder again, testing the night, pressing against the veil Mokaya had conjured. IT's form twitched, the elongating, the hesitation fading. It sensed the deception. It would not be fooled much long. Zuberi rated out, taking the infant into his arms. The child was warm, but the energy that pulsed from its small body made his skin tingle, as though holding both life and fire. The golden eyes stared up at him, curious, innocent, and yet aware. Nabasi's weak voice called his name from Hut. He turned, his heart breaking. She did not know. She had not seen the creature. She still clung to the hope this was just a difficult birth, that her brother would make everything right. He wanted to tell her the truth, but they're on the team. His jaw tightened. Mokaya pressed the bone relic into his hand, her voice low. "This'll protect you, but only for time. When you reach the sacred land, bury Itide, the child's first cry. The earth will know what to do." Zuberi nodded, thought his chest burned with doubt. He adjusted the child in his arms, feeling its small fingers brush against Hisnan. He glanced once more at the sky, the blackness still holding but trembling at the edges. The creature's whispers sharpened in a growl. It knew. Zuberi took a step toward the village edge, his heart heavy with every sheet, every stride. Behind him, his sister's voice called out again. Ahead, the forest waited, unknown, filled with dangers he could not name. But there in the turning back, the child bellowed Ged to the night. And now, so did he? Zuberi ran with his baby tight against his chest, sweat dripping his face as his feet ripped the dry earth from the savannah. The sound of the river was approaching, but behind it, the guardian's whisper grew, getting closer and closer, carrying the promise of death. Her legs burned, her lungs seemed to catch fire, but he couldn't stop. The baby moved, dropping a weak moan, and Zuberi further tightened the cloth that surrounded him. He jumped into the river, the cold water biting his legs, while the shadow stopped on the bank, shouting with a sound that made the earth tremble. With one last effort, Zuberi reached the other bank. The sun broke the clouds. The guardian disappeared. The baby opened his eyes. They were no longer golden. They were brown, like any other. Zuberi fell to his knees, tears dripping. He had never believed in the rules. Now I knew they were true. In the village, everyone bowed in respect. The sun came back, but no one would challenge the morning anymore. If you enjoyed this video, please help us grow by subscribing to this humble channel. And if you'd like to watch more videos like this, we prepared the next video especially for you. Click here to watch.